Father, we just thank you for this evening, Lord. Just ask that we would come into your word, continuing in a heart of worship. We seek you, Lord, for the things that you have for us tonight, Lord. Just give you our attention. We give you our hearts and our minds. Just ask you, Lord, to teach us. Just yield to your Spirit's work here tonight. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Last week we begun this book and we made it through the first verse of chapter 3. And we went through the first verse of 3 because it fit for the end of 2. And we'll pick up with that first verse tonight. And we'll make our way. I was going to try to go through a couple chapters, but there's just too much. So we'll probably just make it through this third chapter tonight. But before we do that, I shared last week that if you were to go back to the original writings, the original manuscripts, that there wasn't a 1 Samuel, there wasn't a 2 Samuel, it was Samuel. But you know, as I come into the study of what we call 2 Samuel, it doesn't surprise me that this is where they split the book. Because we really are in a transition. There really is a large transition going on as David takes his kingship. And these first few chapters are really just that transition period. And we come into tonight's chapters. You're a person who likes a little intrigue in your story, maybe a little bloodletting. This chapter and the next will bring you great joy. But it never was a very clean thing for these administrations to turn over from one king to another. Matter of fact, as much violence as we'll see over these next couple of chapters, it wasn't as violent as it could have been. And most of that was because Saul and Jonathan were already gone. We don't know what David would have done. We think from the heart that he's shown us that he would have spared Saul possibly. I don't know. Jonathan most likely because he promised he would. But it's like the Lord removed them so the problem wouldn't be there. But there's still some house cleaning to be done, and we see that as we're going forward. In the 2 chapters we've already covered, we saw David finding out about Saul's death and therefore finding out about Jonathan's death. And then we saw this great lament that David had for the death of Saul and Jonathan, the song of the bow that we read through. And then we see David anointed the king of Judah, which was only one tribe, but yet it was still part of the kingdom, half the kingdom, because the kingdom was divided at this point. Because then there was the one son that was still left of Saul, Ishbosheth, and he became the king of Israel. And so you've got 2 opposing sides, really over the same people, just different tribes. And then as we wrapped up those first couple of chapters, we saw this confrontation between the men of the 2 different kingdoms coming together to have this little bit of a battle, which turned out to be pretty violent. And Abner, who was leading the armies of Israel, remember he was pursued by one of the brothers of the man that was leading the armies of David. And in that pursuit, the brother of Joash is killed. And that will play into tonight's story as well. I just want to make sure we had that remembrance of where we've come so far. Let's pick up in verse 1. Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. But David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Sons were born to David in Hebron. His firstborn was Amon by the Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. Now, I'm not going to read through those next few verses because I'm going to mention these names as we review these verses, and I don't want to have to say them twice. So going down through verse 5, we see the names of these wives that David took, and we see a son that was given to David through each of these wives. And so what we discover in those first 5 verses is that during David's 7.5 years in Hebron, his kingdom grew stronger, we understand, as it was said here, while Saul's house, who was ruled by Ishbosheth, grew weaker. And as we can see in these verses, that David's family also grew a whole lot larger. When he first came to Hebron, he just had 2 wives, Ahinoam and Abigail. But of course, we see here also, as many do in the Old Testament, contrary to God's will, David married 4 more women. The women are Maacah, Haggith, Abital, and Eglah. You know, I got to say something in my own defense here. These names, it's interesting. Some teachers will skip them. Some teachers, bless their heart, will do their best to say them. And what's very interesting is I'll do my best to say them as they are written so that we're not confused. But the truth is, even as they're written in English, if I told you those names as they actually are in Hebrew, you'd think I was making a mistake. So it's better that I just stumble over the crazy English that we have and you can laugh, as opposed to me giving you the actual true Hebrew, which I could, and you'd be like, wow, how did he mess that up? But it's actually in the way they wrote him in English that messes it all up. So he marries 4 more women, and these for now a total of 6 wives, and from them he has 6 sons, 3 of whom were to be a great grief to him. Those 3 sons, Amnon, Absalom, and Adonijah. And he had other sons even later on. So his family was definitely large. And we have to comment that David was wrong to have more than one wife. It doesn't say it here, but we can glean that from other places in Scripture. Because having many wives went against God's command, especially to kings. There was laws concerning the kings of Israel, and one of them was this from Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17. It says, "Neither shall he, a king, multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away." And so it was in direct opposition to what God had laid out as rules for kings. And of course, we have God's heart towards marriage all the way in the beginning of Scripture, Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife," not wives, "to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." But also, not in David's defense, but as an explanation, this was not uncommon. Having many wives was one way that great men, especially kings, expressed their power and their status in those days. They wasn't doing anything extra out of the ordinary as far as the culture was concerned or as far as his position was concerned. It says these were born to David in Hebron. And so we know the location all this took place. And when we look at the entirety of his story, we know that God used and blessed David despite the fact that he had many wives, despite that he had made this mistake. And that really is the story of David, is that despite his great sin, God continues to use him because David continues to seek God for his instruction, for his wisdom. But he, like many of us, or most of us, or all of us, tend to bring things upon ourselves in our disobedience. So his family life and these sons were obviously not blessed because so many bad things come through the sons that he had. Just to run down through some of it, the son Amnon, we'll find out later, he rapes his half-sister and was murdered by his half-brother. Chileab is also known as Daniel in 1 Chronicles chapter 3. The few mentions of that son indicate that perhaps he died young or that he was ungodly or an unworthy man. Absalom murders his half-brother and led a civil war against his father, David, attempting to murder him. Adonijah tried to seize the throne from David and David's appointed successor. Then he tried to take one of David's concubines and was executed for his arrogance. And then 2 others, Sephtiah and Ithraim, we can assume that they either died young or were ungodly and unworthy men because they are mentioned only once again in the Scriptures and only in a generic listing of David's son in 1 Chronicles chapter 3 as well. So his track record with his sons was not real good. Let's pick up in verse 6. "Now it was so, while there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, that Abner was strengthening his hold on the house of Saul. And Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. So Ishbosheth said to Abner, 'Why have you gone in to my father's concubine?'" Now remember, Abner is the one who is ruling over the armies of Israel under Ishbosheth. And it appears that Abner supported this weak man, Ishbosheth. Remember, his name meant man of shame. And he supported this weak man in power so he could be the power behind the throne. And as time went on, he increased in strength and influence on the house of Saul. So likely that Abner was strengthening his own political position because he saw the balance of power shifting over to David as David was on his throne longer and longer. And now here in this couple verses, we see Ishbosheth accuse Abner of what then was a serious crime. Taking a royal concubine was regarded as both sexual immorality and treason, because it was seen as stealing his property and making a bid for the throne itself. So let's pick up in verse 8. Then Abner became very angry at the words of Ishbosheth and said, "Am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Today I show loyalty to the house of Saul your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not delivered you into the hand of David. And you charge me today with a fault concerning this woman? May God do so to Abner and more also, if I do not do for David as the Lord has sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan to Beersheba." And he could not answer Abner another word because he feared him. Now, we don't know if Abner was actually guilty of what he was accused of here. He certainly denied it forcefully. He denied it with disrespect for the king. And he announced now that he was going to transfer his loyalty and the tribes of Israel to David. So this was quite a turning point that this accusation led to. And Ishbosheth was powerless to resist because Abner was his power. And now his power was standing up against him. We have this very interesting statement that Abner says. He asks this question in his anger. He says, "Am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah?" I mean, that's what I would have said, right? But what he means there, he says, "Am I a worthless, contemptible traitor who has been loyal to Judah in the past?" In other words, I mean, have I come against you? Have I supported Israel or Judah instead of Israel? And obviously the answer is no. So he made his point, and Ishbosheth had nothing he could say in response. Verse 12. Then Abner sent messengers on his behalf to David, saying, "Whose is the land?" Saying also, "Make your covenant with me, and indeed my hand shall be with you to bring all Israel to you." And David said, "Good, I will make a covenant with you. But one thing I require of you. You shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see my face." So David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, "Give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for 100 foreskins of the Philistines." And Ishbosheth sent and took from her husband from Paltiel, the son of Laish. Then her husband went along with her to Bahurim, weeping behind her. So Abner said to him, "Go, return." And he returned. Kind of a sad scene. So Abner now sent messengers to David, and he offers to turn over all of Israel to him. And before David would agree to that, he demands that Michal, Saul's daughter, be returned to him, hoping thereby to strengthen his claim to Saul's kingdom. Now you remember that Michal was David's wife originally. It was one of Saul's daughters, but in a fit of rage, Saul took her back and gave her to another man, just to spite David. And it's interesting because of all things David thinks he needs is another wife. But it is interesting to me because this was a legitimate first wife. I mean, if he had stopped there, maybe things would have went better. And it's interesting too, just in his humility, he says that he betrothed 100 foreskins in earning her hand. And yet it was way more than that, but he's humble because that's all that was requested. But he doubled that when he brought to Saul what was asked for. So he hopes to strengthen his claim on Saul's kingdom by having one of his daughters returned to him as his wife. And Ishbosheth meekly consented, and Michal was brought to David to the great grief of her husband, Paltiel. And again, that's kind of a sad scene. Here's this man, her husband, follows her up to a point where Abner says, "You can come no further," weeping behind her. So obviously it was a man in love with this woman. And we don't know what she thought. We don't know if she was happy to go back to David or if she was as upset as her husband was. But then David's personal life becomes even a further mess. And another dark chapter is recorded in his story. Verse 17, "Now Abner had communicated with the elders of Israel, saying, 'In time past you were seeking for David to be king over you. Now then, do it. For the Lord has spoken of David saying, by the hand of my servant David I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and the hand of all their enemies. And Abner also spoke in the hearing of Benjamin. Then Abner also went to speak in the hearing of David in Hebron all that seemed good to Israel and the whole house of Benjamin. So it's important this word came from Abner regarding David instead of coming from David himself. I mean, David was the rightful king, but he wouldn't reign over Israel until they submitted to him freely. And that's just another insight to the character of David. And I think of Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 10, verse 8, and he says, freely you have received, freely give. And David didn't really, in a sense, earn his kingship other than the patience that he had to endure all that he's endured for 20-some years, waiting for it to be fulfilled. But he knows that what he has, he was given, and he's not going to take anything. He's waiting for that to be given to him in full. He's letting the Lord work his work. It's also very interesting in those verses that it says by Abner's voice, for the Lord has spoken of David. Now, it's interesting because Abner was a general, not a biblical scholar. And yet he knew these prophecies. And the fact is that he could ask the leaders of Israel to consider those prophecies about David in doing what they needed to do, which means it was widely known, the prophecies about David. They would have known who he was and what he was supposed to become. But sadly, they were not widely obeyed. Most of Israel was lukewarm and unenthusiastic in their embrace of David as king, which is interesting because it seems to be the response in general to a lot of what God has promised us, that there is a lukewarmness and there is a lack of motivation or excitement sometimes. I think about the prophecies that we wait on today. I think about the things we see being fulfilled before us today. And quite frankly, very often you look across the church at large and there's a lukewarmness. There's a lack of enthusiasm for the things that God is doing or how much is being yet to be fulfilled. I mean, we see so many things lined up right now that just sit perfectly with prophecy. And I think sometimes the church just misses it and then misses the excitement. And if you miss the excitement and don't know the prophecies, then so many of the things that we see can be things that bring fear, when we should know that it's God at work and there should be no fear included. So Abner then went to the tribe of Benjamin and to the other tribes that had followed Ishbosheth. He told them that David was God's promised means of saving them from the oppression of the Philistines. Apparently the response was favorable, so he visited David and expressed his readiness to gather all Israel together in a great expression of allegiance. Verse 20. So Abner and 20 men went with him to David at Hebron. And David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. Then Abner said to David, I will rise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, and they may make a covenant with you. They may reign over all your heart's desire. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So David makes a feast for Abner. And this was David showing himself wise and generous towards a former adversary. I mean, David was a lot of things, and I don't like using the word because of how we see it today, but he was quite the politician as well. He really knew how to maneuver things in that realm. But he had observed a lot in his life, and he'd seen the poorest of examples. You know, a lesser man would never forgive Abner for leading an army against God's king, but David was great, wise, and generous, and he always seems to live that out, although he stumbled, as we know. I think what just impresses me about David time and time again, he's just has a willingness to get out of God's way. And we talked about that in 1 Samuel. He's just willing to get out of God's way. Now, I say that having just pointed out all his sin, so he was definitely good at tangling himself up in bad decisions and the consequences that came from it. But yet there was this heart in him that God himself recognized, which is why he called him a man after his own heart. Because he was so good at just getting out of God's way when he was thinking right and let God do what God needed to do. And Abner promises him a beautiful promise, is that you may reign over all that your heart desires. So it seems Abner, to some degree, is very sincere, and he wanted David's reign to be fully realized over the people of God. Look at verse 22. At that moment, the servants of David and Joab came from a raid and brought much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David in Hebron, for he had sent him away and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the troops that were with him had come, they told Joab, saying, Abner the son of Ner came to the king, and he sent him away and he has gone in peace. Then Joab came to the king and said, What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why is it that you sent him away and he is already gone? Surely you realize that Abner the son of Ner came to deceive you, to know you're going out and you're coming in, and to know all that you are doing. In my review of the last couple of chapters, I said Joash instead of Joab, sorry. But we see now that Joab's angry because Joab still has a vendetta against Abner because Abner killed his brother. And so we need to keep that in mind in Joab's reaction. While Abner was leaving David to carry out his plan, Joab returned, we see here, to the royal house, and he heard of these events, and that's what he goes after David for. And he rebukes the king for what he saw as foolishly entertaining a spy. And now we'll see that he secretly sent out soldiers to bring Abner back. He wasn't going to let the king have his way in this. Verse 26. And when Joab had gone from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, who brought him back from the well of Sirah. But David did not know it. Now when Abner had returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him privately, and there stabbed him in the stomach, so that he died with the blood of Asahel, his brother. So as soon as he returns to Hebron, Joab pretended he wanted a private interview near the gate. Now, his real purpose, as we just saw, was to kill Abner in revenge, which he did by stabbing him in the stomach, avenging his brother Asahel's death, and eliminating a potential arrival of a commander-in-chief. You know, it's interesting because when we studied in Book of Numbers, you might recall, there were the cities that God set apart as cities of refuge. So that if somebody had murdered somebody by accident, they could make their way to a city of refuge until their case was heard and they'd be protected there. Well, in this case, remember, this death was brought on in self-defense. And so Joab was actually in a city, Hebron, that was one of the cities that God appointed as a city of refuge. But also we see that Joab was what God termed the avenger for his brother, and had the legal right to go after him and pursue him if it was found that he was guilty of a murder that didn't happen by accident. So Joab knows that this is a city of refuge. So what's he do? In telling us that he brings him to the gate, basically he takes him outside the city. So he washes his hands of the situation that he's in refuge by taking him into the gate, which in this case means outside the city, and he kills him there, taking himself off the hook, at least in that little bit of a case. So he was definitely planning how he would do this. Verse 28, afterward when David heard it, he said, My kingdom and I are guiltless before the Lord forever of the blood of Abner, the son of Ner. Let it rest on the head of Joab and all his father's house, and let there never fail to be in the house of Joab one who has discharge, or is a leper, who leans on a staff, or falls by the sword, who lacks bread. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, killed Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel at Gibeon in the battle. So David knew he had nothing to do with this murder. Among other evils, this murder committed by Joab set a bad precedent. It gave David's administration a reputation for brutality, and it made it harder for David to win the rest of Israel over to his side. So David pronounced a severe curse against Joab and his family, and it is pretty severe. And I wonder about this curse. I mean, what power David actually had as a man to give a curse upon a family. If God was going to honor that and bring that about, I don't know. I just found it interesting that he felt that he had some power. Why else would he speak these words? Otherwise, I mean, people would have known they were empty. But he speaks these words against this family, that there would basically continuously be disease and crippling and a lack of food. But notice that he did nothing to correct Joab. Maybe David was afraid to lose Joab as a general. I don't know. He definitely gave it to God. He cursed them, but he kind of left it to God. And I don't know. Perhaps in David's eyes, Joab was a bad man, but not necessarily a bad general. I don't know. It's hard to get good employees. Verse 31. Then David said to Joab and to all the people who were with him, "Tear your clothes, gird yourselves with sackcloth, and mourn for Abner." And King David followed the coffin. So they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king sang a lament over Abner and said, "Should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, nor your feet put into fetters. As a man falls before wicked men, so you fell." Then all the people wept over him again. And when all the people came to persuade David to eat food while it was still day, David took an oath, saying, "God do so to me and more, if I taste bread or anything else till the sun goes down." Then all the people took note of it, and it pleased them, since whatever the king did pleased all the people. For all the people in all Israel understood that day that it had not been the king's intent to kill Abner, the son of Ner. Then the king said to his servants, "Do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And I am weak today, though anointed king, and these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too harsh for me. The Lord shall repay the evildoer according to his wickedness." So we see David proclaim this great time of mourning for Abner. And it grieved the king that Abner should have died so in such a kind of a shameful way, since his courage and power deserved a more honorable death. The thought in verse 33 here, did Abner die like an inexperienced fool who knew not how to defend himself? And the intended answer to that question was no. He fell victim to a deceitful, wicked plot. And the people knew by the king's sorrow for Joab, or he knew by the king's sorrow that Joab had acted independently. And so it really did take David off the hook by his public display of grief for Abner's death. In fact, David publicly expressed his displeasure at the cruelty of the sons of Zeruiah and called on the Lord to punish them. So in this chapter, as we wrap it up, we've seen God using the sin and intrigue of men to give this united kingdom to David. And from that we learn that God makes even the wrath of men to praise him. God wastes nothing. As a matter of fact, the psalmist wrote of that, Psalm 76, verse 10. It says, "Surely the wrath of man shall praise you. With the remainder of wrath you shall gird yourself." And so, I think it's just one more of those places that we read and we realize that all the injustice, all the wickedness, all the darkness that we see, God will use it to bring praise to himself. Because God's not unfamiliar with the things taking place. These things aren't arbitrary, and they're not a surprise to God. And ultimately, they will fit his greater plan. And in the end, all glory will be his. And so God uses everything, the good, the bad, the ugly. So I think that's encouraging no matter how much of the bad and the ugly we need to see. So we'll rest there, and we'll pick up in chapter 4 next week.